Place, you see, the talk. All righty, let's get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to PNP Live. My name is Margaret Orto, and I'm the events coordinator in the Children and Teens Department at Politics and Prose. Thank you for joining Politics and Prose in partnership with DC Public Library this afternoon for this very special event with Cheryl, Willis, Hudson, and Wade Hudson, who will discuss their recent collaboration, The Talk, Conversations about Race, Love, and Truth. We'd like to thank the District of Columbia Public Library Foundation for generously donating complimentary copies of The Talk to the first 50 attendees to request it during registration. To those attendees who selected this option, if you haven't already picked up your book at your selected Politics and Prose bookstore branch, don't forget to do so. The books are ready. Simply give your name to a bookseller and they will check that you're on the list to receive a copy. For those picking up at the Connecticut Avenue store, please go to the Children and Teens Department for pickup. This afternoon, we'll also drop the book purchase link for The Talk into the chat during this conversation for anyone who wasn't able to participate in the comp copy offer. And the book is always available for purchase in our stores, either online or in person. Today, at the end of the Hudson's presentation, we'll get to audience questions and answer as many as possible. Thanks to those of you in the audience who have already submitted questions in advance. There is also the opportunity for audience members to ask a question today by clicking on the Q&A located at the bottom of your screen and entering your question there. You can also upvote on a question that you'd like to see answered. We ask that everyone be respectful of one another in any questions and comments. Now, that's all the announcements. Now on to the event you're all waiting for. I'm delighted to turn the program over to Wendy Lukehart, Youth Collections Specialist for DC Public Library, who will moderate today. In addition to her role at the library, Wendy also reviews children's books for Kirkus and School Library Journal and is active in the American Library Association, serving on book award committees and arranging conferences on visual literacy. Wendy, I'm delighted to turn it over to you to introduce our guests.
Thank you, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be here today with Politics and Prose and such distinguished bookmakers. To all our viewers, let me say that the Hudsons have prepared a fascinating talk with many wonderful images. It will show you a lot about their lives, so I will not duplicate that information. Instead, I want to make 2 points. The first is Cheryl Willis Hudson and Wade Hudson are rock stars. Not only are they at the helm of their own publishing company, Just Us Books Incorporated, but they have each written over 25 books with a variety of other publishers. Just this year, Cheryl collaborated with curators from the National Museum of African American History and Culture to produce a book entitled Brave Black First, 50 African American Women Who Changed the World. It includes many women that DC residents are proud to connect to, such as civil rights icon Dorothy Height, and the first Black person and woman to head the Library of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden. Wade created a collection of poems about the range of his life experiences that was just released in a book called Journey. Both Cheryl and Wade have won numerous awards for their books and have been inducted into the International Literary Hall of Fame for writers of African descent. The second thing I want to tell you is that they created Just Us Books 32 years ago, after noticing how difficult it was to find Black interest books for their own 2 children. From my perspective, in watching publishers come and go over this span of time, it must be said that the continuing success of an independent publisher through all the ups and downs of the market over this span of time is no small accomplishment. I want to congratulate you both, Cheryl and Wade, on your vision and achievements, and on all the beautiful Black characters, information, and culture you have shared with readers young and old, particularly in the long stretch of time before #WeNeedDiverseBooks existed. You clearly recognized a need and addressed it with passion and great skill. Now, please tell us your story and how you came to invite a star-studded group of authors and illustrators to delve into the timely book we are here to celebrate today, the Talk, Conversations about Race, Love, and Truth.
Thank you so much, Wendy. We're going to go to screen share now. We're so happy to be with you today and to share the book, The Talk, but also share our story as well. Here we go. Okay, now we're in business. As Cheryl and I travel across the country pre-pandemic, talking to students and parents and teachers, one thing that we notice is that most people in America know very little about people who come from different experiences and different cultures and different ethnic groups. And much of what most people in America know about people who are different from themselves are based on assumptions and stereotypes and caricatures. And when we think we are making progress and moving forward, there's always someone or some group who comes along and sort of reignites those negative images of the past. And then we have to deal with them all over again. So we feel it's important that we share our story, share who we are and where we've been, and also Black history, because I think it's important for us to get to know more about each other. So that's what we're going to do today as we lead up to talking about the talk. Now, we started Just Us Books in 1988 because, simply put, there were few books in the marketplace, in libraries, or in schools that had characters and stories that drew from Black history, Black culture, and Black experiences.
As authors, we had gone to a number of publishers. I'm trying to. Are you seeing our screen share?
Yes.
Okay, so who we are. As authors, we had gone to a number of publishers with stories that we had written. We had manuscripts, but we were told, however, that there was no market for these kinds of books, specifically an alphabet book, and that parents, actually Black parents, didn't buy books. We knew that this wasn't true, and the problem was there were too few books available that featured characters to which Black parents and their children could readily relate. Black people not buying books was a lie, not the truth. At that time, there was little research to ascertain the book buying habits of Black Americans. And when studies were done, it was found that Black people indeed did buy books, especially Black women. So during the 32 years of our business, we took a leap of faith in 1988 and decided to form our own company, starting with concept books, Afrobet's ABC book, up to biographies, picture books, books of poetry, nonfiction, and anthology. And as Wendy said, we're celebrating 32 years in the publishing industry now. Now, as a child, I love books, and I was reminded that my roots went deep. I was a doodler. I loved doing book reports. My mother actually was a teacher. Not only was she a teacher, she taught French. And she loved to speak in French and recite poetry in French. My father loved poetry as well. So I'm kind of deeply ensconced in family literacy. And the evidence came, and you'll see a picture here of my great-grandfather who was born in 1812, who was enslaved, but actually his father was a free man, which gives you kind of a little bit of history that we have to delve into. And I've always wondered about those pictures that I've seen in family albums. There was a story written in the Richmond Times-Dispatch when my grandmother, his daughter, Isaline Willis, had a story written about her birthday. She was in her 90s. She lived to be 99. And the headline of the story said, "Daughter of former slave cherishes her freedom." And my grandmother was a very literate person who could read and write, but actually left school in the 7th grade when she was 17 years old to help her father. But one of the discoveries that was brought to mind in this family history of family literacy is a Bible owned by my great-grandfather, Henry Spurlock. And you'll see here on the title page of this Bible, Henry Spurlock, Henry's Book, 1848. Despite the fact that Blacks were not allowed to read or write, it was against the law to have them read or write. Some kind of way, my great-grandfather knew how to write his own name and pass down this literacy through this Bible and through my grandmother. So my early love of book reports helped me to be established in a middle-class Black family. There's my mother, my father. We were kind of the Ebony magazine. That was the periodical that was in our household. And I colored and doodled in the margins. I became an art director later, but this was something that I did because all of the textbooks, all of the books that I saw when I was growing up, all of the kids were white. But my first published poems and doodles actually appeared in Ebony Junior magazine after it started in the early 1970s. And there's a couple of the first poems and doodles that I did for Ebony Junior magazine.
Now, Cheryl grew up in Virginia, and I grew up in Louisiana. And when I was growing up, the South was still very segregated. That was the period of Jim Crow. And you can see a couple of pictures here of the small town, a population of about 5,000 people, and about 80% of the population was African American. As I said, it was a period of Jim Crow. I grew up in an all Black community. Actually, there were really two worlds. There was a Black world when we were growing up, and there was a white world. Now, I very seldom saw white people. The only time I actually saw white people was when we went downtown to purchase something. I grew up and went to an all Black elementary school, an all Black junior high school, and an all Black high school. But when I was a kid, I used to sit on my front porch at home in this segregated community and write poems and short stories and short plays. Now, in our school, there were no books at all. Well, actually, there were two books in our school that had any information about the Black experience. There were actually two biographies, one of Booker T. Washington and the other of George Washington Carver. So I would write stories about the people I knew, the neighbor next door who I thought was funny. So I would write a story about the neighbor. I would write stories about the kids in my school or in my classroom. Again, trying to give life to the people around me because I could not find any information about those people or people who look like them in the books that we had to read in our school library and in textbooks. These are photographs of my mother and my father. They both grew up on a farm. They were children of tenant farmers. So they actually stopped going to school when they were like 4th or 5th grade. Now, Cheryl grew up in a middle-class, Black middle-class family, and there's a difference between a Black middle class and the regular middle class. But I grew up in a poor family. There were 8 children in total, and then my mother and my father. As I said, I love to write. When I was growing up, when I was in the 9th grade, I actually wrote a play about democracy versus communism. And I asked my 9th grade history teacher if we could actually mount the play. And he encouraged me and said yes. So we actually mounted this play when I was in the 9th grade. I was the producer and the playwright. But when I graduated from high school, I went to Southern University, an all Black, at that time, an all Black university in the southern part of the state of Louisiana. It was there that I found out about all these wonderful writers that I didn't know about: Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, Gwendolyn Brooks, and on and on and on. And so a whole new world opened up for me. And that was when I really thought and felt that I could become a writer. And I really started to take my writing seriously. I also got involved in the civil rights movement of that period as well, the student movement, and did voter registration drives in parts of Mississippi and Louisiana. But I continued to write, and actually wrote several plays that were produced there in Louisiana. Cheryl and I met in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1971, a long time ago. And it was there that we really started to connect and think about writing stories for children. And actually, I wrote a number of stories for children, created an actual series that Cheryl helped to illustrate. And that really set us on the path to really thinking about writing and producing work for children. Now, this is the first book, children's book, that I had published. It came out in 1974. It was published by New Dimensions Publishing Company out of New York. And it was really aimed at the educational market. But this was my first published book. And you can see me with that big afro of that period. But when we started Just Us Books, Cheryl and I really did not know about the rich history of Black publishing and Black literature. We did not know how Black people that really fought to tell their own stories, to plead their own cause, and to define themselves, because for so long, others had defined them. Slave owners had defined them to justify slavery. And some white people believed that people from Africa were better off enslaved than running, quote, naked in the jungles of what they called at that time the Dark Continent. In fact, Rudyard Kipling summed up this view in a poem that he wrote that was published in 1899. Now, the United States was at war with the Philippine Islands. And so Kipling felt that the United States should really go in and just take over the country and the people, much as England and other Western European countries had done in Africa, India, China, and other territories. So in this poem, he writes about that. I'm going to read just a couple of stanzas for you. He wrote, "Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." And these are people of color, half devil and half child. "Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, to by open speech and simple and 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain." Yes, this is the same Kipling who wrote The Jungle Book, Kim, Captain's Courageous, and one of my favorite poems when I was growing in the elementary school, If, and we had to memorize that poem. Although The White Man's Burden was written centuries after slavery was instituted, it reflected the views of those who started slavery. So recognizing how central defining others is to domination and control led us to write this statement when we started Just Us Books. Images, whether in print, film, television, or on stage, are constantly shaping the way we feel and what we think and believe. This is particularly crucial to the African-American community, which has been deliberately given negative images of its history and culture. We find it rewarding to help reshape and change those negative images to reflect truth. We think the struggle to present the correct images, the truth, is the most crucial one facing us all. So we share these truths. Can you imagine Lucy Terry, who was captured in Africa and brought to America to be a slave? She was freed subsequently by her husband, who purchased her freedom. She wrote a poem about a 1746 incident. The poem was memorialized orally and then published in 1855. So Lucy Terry is credited as being the first documented African-American woman poet. During a time when Black people were said to not have the acumen to think intellectually, imagine what Jupiter Hammond had to endure to get his poems published in 1761.
And what about Phyllis Wheatley? She was the first Black American to have a collection of poems published. Before her collection of poems, which was called Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, were released in 1773, she actually had to go to court to defend her authorship. People did not believe that a Black woman could write these poems. And several prominent Boston citizens, including John Hancock, yes, the one who signed the Declaration of Independence, determined that she had in fact written the poems and signed an attestation, which was included in the front of the book. There were others during this period, including George Moses Horton. And after the War of Independence, the spirit of freedom was high among the 500,000 free Black Americans and the 2 million enslaved, just as it was in white Americans. And free Black Americans, mostly in northern cities, began forming their own organizations, churches, businesses, and fraternal groups because white society would not accept them. James Forten was one of these, a wealthy Black salesmaker in Philadelphia. They fought as best they could against the racism, but the top of their agenda was freeing their brothers and sisters who were enslaved. They also organized the Underground Railroad to assist Black Americans in finding and escaping from that brutal organization, of that brutal system. Obviously, writing and publishing were really important weapons in this fight. And in 1827, just a decade or so after my great-grandfather, Henry Spurlock, was born, a group of free African Americans in New York City founded the first Black newspaper in the United States called Freedom's Journal. In the first editorial, the founders wrote, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. Too long has the public been deceived by misrepresentations in things that concern us dearly."
For 2 years, Freedom's Journal served a community of 300,000 African Americans in the North. It was distributed in 11 states and the District of Columbia, as well as in Europe, Canada, and Haiti. Freedom's Journal was followed by no less than 24 other African American newspapers, as well as magazines in the years leading up to the Civil War. Among those publications was the North Star, published by Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Now, some Black Americans who escaped from slavery shared their stories through memoirs called slave narratives. These slave narratives presented the reality of slavery and counteracted the rosier picture portrayed by those who supported slavery. Harriet Tubman, Harriet Jacobs, and Frederick Douglass published accounts of their enslavement and escape. Some 6,000 African Americans who were former slaves in the US and in the Caribbean wrote accounts of their lives. About 100 of those became books. Now, the first African American writers usually wrote poetry. But during the decade before the Civil War, African Americans began to branch out in other areas of literature. In 1853, abolitionist William Wells Brown published Clotel, the President's Daughter, based on the rumor at the time, which was actually the truth, of President Thomas Jefferson's relationship with his slave, Sally Hemings. It is considered the first novel written by an African American. But because it was published in England, where Brown was then living, the honor of being the first novel by an African American to be published in the US belongs to Harriet Wilson. Her novel, Our Nig, about the discrimination and difficulties Northern free Blacks faced, was published in 1859. A prolific writer, William Wells Brown, is also credited as having the first published play written by an African American, The Escape or A Leap for Freedom, published in 1858. Abolitionist Frances Ellen Harper in 1845, at the age of 20, published a volume of verse, Forest Leaves or Autumn Leaves. Her second collection was published in 1854, and several short stories appeared in Anglo-African magazine.
Following the Civil War, Black Americans left those plantations and established their own communities. They organized schools and churches, and that was their primary objective. Reading material there, reading materials for Sunday schools and their church services. Already organized into associations, these organizations began publishing books and resources that address their specific needs and experiences as Black Americans. In fact, the first Black publishing company was established by a church organization in 1817, 5 years after my great-grandfather was born, by the AME Church. Another Black denomination, the AMEZ Church, established a second publishing company in 1841, and the National Black Publishing Board was established in 1896. Following the war, and particularly during the period of Reconstruction, a number of colleges for Black students would form, particularly and mostly by church groups, and as a result of land grant legislation. Several of these institutions, now called historically Black colleges and universities, established publishing and printing programs, including Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, in 1879, Howard University in 1916, and Fisk University in Nashville in 1932. So you can see that there are commercial publishers as well, Orion Press, Associated Publishers, and J.A. Rogers Publishing Company.
We wish to plead our own cause. We wish to tell our own stories. Paul Laurence Dunbar was one of the most prolific Black writers of the late 1800s and one of the first to gain national recognition. Some of his work, written in Black dialect, was ridiculed, but it didn't deter him. A poet, novelist, and playwright, Dunbar's first book, a collection of poems titled Oak and Ivy, was published in 1893. Dunbar died at the age of 32, but during his short life, he published a dozen books of poetry, 4 books of short stories, 4 novels, lyrics for In the Homie, the first all-African-American musical produced on Broadway in 1905, and he also found time to write a play. But it was during the Harlem Renaissance, spanning the 1920s, that an intellectual, cultural, social, and artistic explosion occurred. The explosion was centered in Harlem, New York, but its impact reached other cities. Poetry, novels, short stories, and plays were created like never before. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Jessie Fawcett, Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, Conti Cullen, and Ann Spencer were just a few of the writers who emerged during this period. All of them were published by white publishing companies, but they helped to set the course for other Black writers to follow. Richard Wright's Native Son, published in 1940, was the first book by a Black American to become a Book of the Month selection and to remain on the bestsellers list. Gwendolyn Brooks was the first African American to win a Pulitzer Prize for literature. Annie Adam, her collection of poems, won the award in 1950. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man won the National Book Award in 1953. And in 1953, James Baldwin's first book, Go Tell It on the Mountain, was published. What did all these Black pioneers have in common? As the Freedom's Journal first editorial stated, they wished to plead their own cause, to tell their own stories, to define and share their own experiences.
But who was telling the stories and who told the stories to our children? Black children, however, during this time were entertained by books that rendered them and the people who looked like them in stereotypical narratives and illustrations. Joel Chandler Harris, Uncle Remus Tales, and Helen Bannerman's Little Black Sambo were typical examples. I saw some of these books when I was growing up in the 1950s. Harris collected African-American stories, songs, and oral folk tales starting in 1880, and he published 9 volumes of this character featuring Uncle Remus as the narrator. The stories in those volumes were read and reread countless times in classrooms across the United States. In 1946, for example, Walt Disney produced a movie called Song of the South based on the Uncle Remus tales. Uncle Remus is viewed in stereotypical ways as a Black caricature, and to this day, Tar Baby, a character in one of Harris's most popular tales, has really negative connotations. Now, Bannerman's first published version of Little Black Sambo takes place in India and reflected stereotypes in that country common there. When it was published in the United States, it reflected the racist views common here, including the artistic renderings of Little Black Sambo from 1899 up until the present, because that book is still in print and enjoyed millions of sales and left indelible impression. But thank God for the Brownies book that came along in 1921. And during this period, we're reminded again that we wish to plead our own cause. We wish to tell our own stories. So Jessie Fawcett, Langston Hughes, Augusta Dill started this magazine called the Brownies Book, where the children were also called Children of the Sun. And this magazine helped to establish Black children's literature in this country. A little bit later, in 1932, Langston Hughes and Anna Bontemps wrote Popo and Fafina, which took place in Haiti. It was illustrated by E. Sims Campbell, and that became a seminal work in Black children's literature.
In 1942, John H. Johnson used $500 in a loan he secured by using his mother's furniture as collateral to start Negro Digest. Within months, the magazine had a circulation of over 50,000. Johnson started the monthly Ebony magazine in 1945, and in 1951, the weekly Jet magazine. He continued to grow his publishing empire, establishing a commercial printing company in 1961. During the 1960s, the period of the Civil Rights Movement, Black Power, women's rights, and the anti-war movement, there were a number of Black publishing companies established. These presses gave many Black writers the opportunity to be published, including Nikki Giovanni, Sonia Sanchez, Audre Lorde, Amiri Baraka, and Alice Walker. And you can see some of these publishing companies listed here. And a few of them are still publishing. Third World Press is still publishing. Black Classic Press is still publishing. Africa World Press is still publishing. And of course, Just Us Books is still publishing. So as you can see, there's a rich legacy of writing and publishing by Black Americans, as we have fought to, in the words of that first Freedom's Journal editorial, plead our own cause and to speak for and about ourselves and our own experiences. That struggle continues today, despite the progress that has been made. And that is why, after 32 years, we continue to produce books at Just Us Books, books such as The Talk, Conversations About Race, Love, and Truth, published in partnership with Crown Books for Young Readers. Now, we conceived of this book as a follow-up to the first anthology, We Rise, We Resist, We Raise Our Voices, which brought together 30 diverse authors and illustrators who were book creators of books for children and young adults. That book was so well received, and it established a conversation among the writers and the illustrators and young people and even teachers. And we wanted to continue that conversation. So we thought of The Talk because we recognize that there are many different kinds of talks that parents must have with their children. And those talks are really based on their own experiences and obstacles and challenges that they find, again, related to who they are. For example, Black people often have the talk about how to deal when a youngster encounters a police officer. But we also have the talk about how to protect yourself and how to avoid the obstacles of being Black in society too. So those are talks that we have. So what we wanted to do is present in this book the variety of talks that different people must have in order for them to remain often safe in society.
So as educators and parents, we really encourage you to look at this anthology as a resource filled with a variety of literary perspectives that are available as starting points to conversations, because the words are constantly changing in our national discourses. What do children know about systemic racism, injustice, fairness, equality, equity, white privilege, diversity, and inclusion? While young people might not have the specific jargon at hand to talk about these observations and experiences, the situations really do exist. So you'll see here that we've curated this with a number of illustrators, writers from different backgrounds. There's 17 entries. There are 30 contributors. The authors are Black, Indigenous, Cherokee, Iranian American, Puerto Rican, Chinese American, Cuban American, Jewish, Trini, Vietnamese American, and white. Our illustrators are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Mexican American, biracial, Honduran, Brazilian, and white. And we are showing just some samples of illustrations by the authors, Renee Watson, Shadra Strickland, Meg Medina, who talks about language, and also Tracy Batiste. And again, there are 30 contributors, including Grace Lynn, Christopher Myers, and we have teachers' guides to help to navigate some of the questions that may arise. So actually, Wade is going to read one of the parts of the bike from the talk.
I know that the bike has been uploaded for viewers to read. So what I'm going to do is read a part of it now. And I want to just provide some context. I think I said earlier, I grew up in a very large family. And I guess in today's language, we would be called economically disadvantaged, but during that time we were called poor. So it was very difficult for my parents to provide for us the way they wanted to. And they tried their best, and we did have I guess a relatively good life, and we thank them for what they were able to do for us. When I was about 8 years old, I wanted a bike. And I just knew I was going to get this bike. And I didn't think about the challenges that it would pose for my parents. As a little kid, I just wanted the bike, and I couldn't wait for Christmas to come so I can get the bike. So here it is, the bike illustrated by E.B. Lewis. And I'm going to read just a little bit from it for you. The bicycle ad in the newspaper seemed to leap off the page as I looked at it, beaming. Just what I want for Christmas, I told my brother Willie, showing him the ad. I want one too, he seconded. If you were growing up in Mansfield, Louisiana when I was a kid, you had to have a bike. Willie and I ran to the living room to show our parents the ad. Dad, Mom, I yelled. This is what I want for Christmas. I held the ad out for my father to see. It's a Swin, the newest model. I want one too, Willie chimed in. My father looked at the ad from a distance as if he didn't want to see it. Mom didn't look at it at all. Don't bother your father, she said, continuing to mend a torn shirt of mine. He's trying to rest. Christmas is still a ways off. My father finally spoke. We'll see, son. We'll see, is all he said. I was 8 and Willie was 7. I couldn't wait to get my very own bicycle. We had learned to ride our neighbor's bike, but there was nothing like having your own. Willie and I were so excited as we lay in our bed on Christmas Eve, we could barely fall asleep. We just knew we would have our bikes the next morning. Our Christmas tree would be too small to place the bikes under it. So we knew when we arose early on Christmas morning, in the middle of our living room floor, there would be 2 Swin bicycles. I awoke first and began rubbing the sleep from my eyes. I looked over at Willie, who was still sleeping. Willie, it's morning, I said, shaking my brother to wake him. Let's go see our bikes. We both jumped out of bed and ran as fast as we could to the living room, but there were no bicycles. We didn't get them, Willie said in a dejected voice. Tears began to well in my eyes. Softly, I said to Willie, no, I guess we didn't. So we will now entertain questions. Wendy, thank you.
Certainly. Wade, you're leaving us there right on the on a exciting part of your story. I know the listeners will want to know the end to that. Well, thank you, Cheryl and Wade, for this wonderful overview of publishing and for your reading, Wade. And to our listeners, we still have room for a few more questions if you want to enter them into the Q&A section of this program. But we do have some questions, and I want to read some of them now. Rochelle Ashur writes, thank you so much for this information. I am taking notes to add to the units we are teaching. I love listening to you. I always learn something new.
Thank you,
Rachel.
thank you.
Rochelle.
Yeah.
And related to that, Leslie Tapscott writes, good evening. You have both done a prolific amount of research. What was the most surprising or unexpected or interesting thing you learned while researching African American literature?
Oh.
I think just the breadth of writing and attempts to of Black people to tell their own stories in different ways. As I said earlier in the presentation, we were not aware of that rich history, and we are still learning. I mean, we are still learning about what Black people did to tell their own stories. You know, how they, I mean, we didn't know, for example, that the first publishing company was started in 1817, you know, and that was really during the period of time when Black churches began to emerge. So Black publishing really was emerging at the same time that Black institutions and Black businesses, and actually Black America itself was emerging.
And the fact that so much of this was hidden and we're not aware of it. So the access to this information was not available.
And then so much research still needs to be done, to uncover all this wonderful history that we don't know about.
Well, thank you for bringing so much of it to light today. Linda Duggins writes, I have such admiration for both of you, Cheryl and Wade. How have you been able to stay connected to your truth and sanity for so long? With love, Linda D. She writes.
That's a good question.
We know Linda.
Question about sanity. Yeah, it's there's a challenge. I think that because in recent years, there has been a groundswell of support of other African-American writers, people in the industry, that just reminds you that you stand on the shoulders of so many other people who have been doing this for a long time. Certainly, some of the publishing companies have stayed in business and gone out of business, but the fact that we have that legacy there and we're continuing to discover it and have that support of networks is really important. Wonderful.
So Sue Barron writes, The Talk is on submissions related to race. Will there be a number 2, The Talk, on another topic?
Well, maybe we should think about that. Not actually, the next project is an anthology that's really focused on social justice and particularly Black Lives Matter, and that's in process now. We have commitments from many wonderful award-winning authors who will be contributing to that. And again, that will be published in partnership with Crown Books, and it will be coming out in September of 2021. So that's the next anthology coming down the pipeline.
So I want to ask you a question. One of my favorite lines in the book is from the poem written by Daniel Nayeri, who was born in Iran and spent several years as a refugee before immigrating to Oklahoma with his family at age 8. In the poem full of advice to his son, he proclaims, "Your mind is the fanciest thing you've got." I like this line so much because we often don't take the time to listen to kids' observations or credit them with the wisdom that they have. This line encapsulates the value of not just having the talk, but in having a listen. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about this and what you may have heard from kids as you make these presentations.
It's very interesting how children respond to not hearing a talk. So I think that that's kind of the answer. I mean, we just did a school visit yesterday, day before yesterday, where 4th grader was just waxing poetic about the need to appreciate Black lives and what she was trying to do with a slideshow in her situation. Kids have that feedback. Kids have a lot of information that they can share, and they know some truths. They suspect when people are lying to them or not wanting to have a conversation. So I don't know if that answers that question, but Daniel's piece was specifically about, it didn't have a title because in Persian poetry, many poems don't have titles. And sometimes parents can talk too much and not listen to what the kids are actually saying.
Exactly.
Yeah, and what we also say too, when we talk to people about the talk and the importance of having the talk, that it should not be a one-way conversation. Because I think engaging in the talk, parents and adults can learn also. So they need to also listen to how children are responding to what is being presented to them. And oftentimes, I mean, children have formed opinions about things. And sometimes those opinions may run counter to what their parents may think, and so the kid may be afraid to share, because he doesn't want to be called on the carpet, so to speak, by the parent. So I think you make an important point, is talking, but it's also listening. And I think as a society, we do not do enough listening. We're so ready to engage in the next conversation and our thoughts. We are thinking about what we are going to say rather than listening to what someone is telling us or saying to us, and we need to really relax more and listen more.
Amen to that. Amy Zai writes, hello, what was it like to work with a multiracial group of authors and contributors? What were the most interesting or surprising similarities and differences you saw between the stories?
It was wonderful. Everybody had a different story. Everybody had a different perspective. We invited people to share their truths and experiences and conversations that they had about truth. And the thing, we're talking about love, we talk about race, but we're talking about love and truth and presenting facts and memoirs. So it was it's great to be able to edit someone that you don't have to do a lot of editing with. So Selena Alco, Tracy Batiste, Derek Barnes, Cosby Cabrera, Roll Call. I mean, everybody, people came from all kinds of backgrounds, and these are artists and illustrators and authors who we've known or been to conferences with, or ALA, or had dinner with. And so that was great. And the things that was common is that everybody has a talk, but everybody's talk is different. And everybody confronts and had confronted certain kinds of stereotypes based on their appearance or their or sexual orientation, or based on a caricature or an othering by someone else. So it's not a Black talk. The commonality is that all of us experience different kinds of talks based on our backgrounds.
And I think also in the children's book publishing industry, those of us who create books, we're really like a community, we pull for each other, we encourage each other, we share the good news about accomplishments that we've enjoyed, and I think the vast majority of us really want a world that's inclusive and embracing and loving. And I think that's why most of us write books for children or create books for children, because I think there's a thread of love that sort of cuts through what we do. And it was really like working with a family. I mean, when we were in contact with the various writers or illustrators, I mean, everybody was just so excited to be a part of the project because they recognized how important it is and how it could really make a difference in the lives of the children who read it. So I mean, we really just embrace each other. Those of us who create books for children, and you would think that we come from the same high school or something. I mean, there's that esprit de corps, that spirit of the group or the team. So. Yeah, I mean, it's just a wonderful experience,
And as a librarian, I just have to say it's wonderful to share your books.
Thank you.
We feel connected.
Yes, indeed. Well, you're part of the family too.
I will just read one more. It's a comment. It's not a question. Just from Alexandra White. She writes, "Thank you so much for your reminders about listening. As a kindergarten teacher, listening not just with my ears, but even more with my eyes. Watching the children is how I learn about their truths and stories. I'm so grateful to be listening to you today. Thank you for your work.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That's what a perfect way to end. Thanks to the audience for joining us today and being such great listeners. And thanks to Wendy for moderating and Cheryl and Wade for being here with us and sharing all their information, knowledge, wisdom. Once again, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase the book. And if you are one of the lucky people that are part of the complimentary copy offer, don't forget to pick up your book at your designated Politics and Prose bookstore branch. And I think that's all the time we have today. I'm sorry to have to end the conversation. I'm sure we could continue on, but now everyone has some tools to go out and share with the people that they're working with. So everyone, thank you again. Stay safe and keep reading.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you. Thank you.